Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Want to go over some controlled opposition, anchored bias, filmmakers, screenwriters, book authors, article writers, because it just really steams me that I've been putting up with this for my whole life. And I want to put everybody on notice that you need to really not believe anything you read or see in magazines and books and film, Hollywood production, publishing houses, big corporate owned media companies, and of course that would include Google. It would include anything that comes off Google search, anything comes off Google platforms, Facebook, FaceCrack, Amazon in the publishing slash book distribution business. I mean, come on, that's a spook platform created by money launderers with a fake leader named Jeff Bezos, whose real name is Jorgensen, Jeffrey Jorgensen, who you know as Bezos, a Cuban name named after his stepfather. You know, a famous Cuban person, sort of like Jose Enrique Menendez. He escaped from Havana, Cuba in 1959 from that communist, that CIA-controlled communist, Fidel Castro, who never was assassinated. Decades went by, no assassination. But lots of other people got assassinated, but not Fidel Castro. I don't know how the CIA is able to pull off Patrice Lumumba, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, John Lennon. Lord have mercy. Just go down the list of all the people, the Diem brothers in Saigon, murdered at the CIA State Department embassy in the back of a van. But they can't seem to put a bullet in Fidel Castro's head. Probably because they don't want to. Right? So, a couple of things here. So, where do I start? So, New York City, let's start there. Let's start in the Big Apple. So, let's start there. Let's start with this fellow by the name of Mark Lane. He was born in February 24th, 1927, and he came into notoriety due to the John Kennedy assassination and challenging the Warren Commission, as if that was a really complicated thing to do, where they had the conclusion written first, which was that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, shot the president, John Kennedy, in Dallas, Texas at approximately 12:30 p.m. on the way out of town near the Triple Underpass. All right, so who's Mark Lane? Well, first of all, that's not his real name, right? So he's a Jewish fellow who was born in the Bronx, New York, and one of the boroughs of New York, the Bronx. He was born Mark Levin, a Jewish name, but somehow, some way, he changed it to Lane because that sounds less Jewish. Then he goes on to Long Island University and then the Brooklyn Law School, where he becomes a lawyer, and he likes to fancy himself as a friend of John Kennedy and the democratic system of government that we never had and we never will have. We'll never have a democratic republic. We'll never have a constitution. We'll never have anything unless people fight for their own freedoms, which in my lifetime I have seen no evidence of people doing so. Well, and they've never had a democracy during my entire lifetime. We've had fake pseudo television reminding you that we have a democracy, but of course everything on television is of course poppycock, and it's untrue. So this Mark Lane character, he endears himself to me because he's going against the government's official version that John Kennedy was murdered by a lone nut from the 6th floor depository, which, by the way, that museum is still there to this day. I've taken the tour, and I actually knelt where the spot of the shot came from, allegedly, which I don't believe it came from. You can't do that today. Even before COVID, they had it plexiglass blocked off. So you can't see what I saw, which is that shot is lame, and there's trees in the way. And there were trees in the way on November 22nd, 1963 either. Anyway, so Mark Lane conducted a number of interviews. So somebody flew him from New York to Dallas, paid for his hotel rooms, paid for his plane flights, organized all these witnesses that I don't know how he tracked them all down by himself alone, right? And then nobody went anywhere near the truth, which was that the limo stopped and parked, and that there was an umbrella man and radio man and Abraham Jabruder, 33 level Freemason, taking film to document the whole thing, and then that goes missing to Time Life magazine and never to be seen for decades. And then when we finally see it, it's heavily edited. This is Mark Lane. And then he goes on to have these staged fake debates with David Atlee Phillips at UCLA in front of all these naive students. And then he repeats those fake debates over at USC, University of Southern California, across town to another group of naive young private school students who are clueless. And they put on this little show and tell act that David Atlee Phillips never met Lee Oswald, but he knows that he did it. He knows he did it, but he never met him. When the truth is that David Atlee Phillips works a career CIA agent, was the handler for Lee Harvey Oswald in the last 90 days of his life, and David Atlee Phillips used the control name, since nobody uses their real name in operations, Maurice Bishop. So Maurice Bishop, aka David Atlee Phillips, positioned Lee Oswald into the book depository where he'd be framed at $1.50 an hour when he was making $8.50 an hour at an Army intelligence film development company across Dallas. And anyway, so what I'm trying to say is Mark Lane is a fraud. He always was a fraud. He injected himself into the JFK assassination as a place that you would glom onto if you didn't believe the Warren Commission. But he works for the CIA, and that's who pays his hotel bills. That's who pays him his consulting fees, undoubtedly. He injected himself into the Jim Garrison murder trial involving Clay Shaw, another CIA longtime career employee in New Orleans, with Carlos Marcello, the drug impresario of the Gulf Coast, is Carlos Marcello, who happens to own the Carousel Club, where Jacob Rubenstein, another Jew, changed his name to Jack Ruby, whose real name was Jacob Rubenstein, from Cicero, Illinois, Chicago area, where Paul Marcinkus is from, the president of the Bank of Vatican. Anyway, Paul Marcinkus, I'll set him aside for a second and focus on Mark Lane. He injects himself into the Clay Shaw murder case for JFK, the only murder case brought in the United States for John F. Kennedy. And he works for the CIA. So like he's palling up to Jim Garrison, who's trying to get Clay Shaw convicted for conspiracy to commit murder. Not the actual trigger puller, but a planner, which he was, because he's involved with the sheep dipping of Lee Oswald in New Orleans, along with Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent, and others, like David Ferry, remember him? The pilot that flew the assassins in and out of Dallas, flew some of the assassins. Then, after the John Kennedy case is kind of exhausted, Mark Lane injects himself with Jim Jones and the Martin Luther King murder by wanting to represent the Martin Luther King family, as well as becoming an attorney for Jim Jones when Jim Jones transferred to French Guiana and Jonestown, away from San Francisco and the People's Temple, and away from Abigail Folger's mother, Enos Mahina, and Hunter S. Thompson, and Bill Graham, and Timothy Leary, right? And Louis Jolian West, who's going to become department head of psychology for UCLA, right? And this is Mark Lane, who is very comfortable at USC and UCLA with his fake debates with people who are on the same team that he's on, the CIA. And Mark Lane's real name is Levin, Mark Levin. Kind of like Harvey Levin at TMZ, another fake news outlet. So what I'm trying to say, I don't know if there's any relationship between Mark Levin and Harvey Levin. There probably is, though, since they both work for the same invisible hand. What I'm saying is Mark Lane passed away on May 10th, 2016 at age 89. So he had a nice long career with the Invisible Hand Clandestine Services. But I'll never believe anything that Mark Lane said or wrote, or any of his phony fake books that he wrote and authored, and any of his phony fake lawsuits with E. Howard Hunt, a career CIA agent, including his wife, Dorothy Wetzel Hunt, who was the money laundering paymaster for the assassins at John F. Kennedy and the paymaster for the Watergate burglars. E. Howard Hunt's wife took care of that. And she got murdered. She got whacked too in an airplane crash in Chicago, Illinois. Oh, yes, she did. David Atlee Phillips, he's a pathological liar. And Gerald Posner, another pathological liar, works for the CIA, and who pretended to get into debates with Mark Lane. So Mark Levin is a fraud. That takes me to 10 years after Mark Lane was born. We have another Brooklyn Jew, Laurence Schiller. He was born on December 28, 1936, essentially 9 years after Mark Levin was born. We have Laurence Schiller, who didn't change his name. He's a Brooklyn-born Jewish fellow from New York. And he goes on to inject himself in with Lee Oswald. He gets flown to Dallas at age 27 to take photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald during the 3 days that he's alive in custody. And Laurence Schiller at age 27, who got him access? I'll tell you, the clandestine services paid his plane flight and paid his plane fare and put him in a hotel and got him into the jail and got him access to Lee Harvey Oswald. That's how Laurence Schiller began his career. Then later, of course, he has to get involved with Jack Ruby, a.k.a. Jacob Rubenstein, another Jewish fellow that changed his name. And then he gets injected into the Sharon Tate murder, even writing a book called The Killing of Sharon Tate, copywritten on January 2nd, 1970, 6 months before the Manson trial begins, 4 months before Charlie Manson was indicted. 4 months before Charlie Manson is indicted, we've got Laurence Schiller writing a book on how Sharon Tate was murdered. How would he know? Unless the clandestine services told him, with Paul Caruso and Richard Caballero, which I believe they did, with this fake, phony Susan Atkins confession that she immediately recanted, within 2 weeks of giving. And she never really gave the confession. It was bullied out of her and attributed to her. I don't know how much utterances came out of Susan Atkins. I think they just used her name and they made up the whole killing of Sharon Tate narrative all by themselves. All right, so, and then of course Laurence Schiller gets involved with the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman murder by the sword. And so he's involved in that along with William Colby, the CIA director's son, Carl Colby. He's involved in the case, along with F. Lee Bailey. He's a CIA lawyer. He got the Ernest Medina acquitted of murder for the My Lai massacre, and he's representing O.J. Simpson, and he gets O.J. Simpson acquitted, right? Along with Johnny Cochran. So what I'm saying is Laurence Schiller's a fraud, right? He's a fraud. He's involved with the O.J. Simpson, Sharon Tate. He's involved with the JFK murder, Lee Oswald, Jack Ruby, Lenny Bruce. He's a screenwriter. He's a photojournalist. He's a film producer, director, which has the same credentials that William Oliver Stone has. Oliver Stone of JFK. So let's see. Oliver Stone was born September 15th, 1946. So guess what? That's 10 years after Laurence Schiller, who is a controlled opposition, fake truth teller. And then, so we've had Mark Lane. Then 9 years later, we have Laurence Schiller. Then 10 years later, we have Oliver Stone, whose real name is Oliver Silverstein, because his father was Louis Silverstein, and somebody changed the name to Stone. William Oliver Stone. William Oliver Silverstein. Louis Silverstein. Anyway, Silverstein by a different name. Stone, right? And what is Oliver Stone's credentials? Screenwriter, director, producer, film producer, dramatist. This is the same thing as Laurence Schiller. It's the same thing as Mark Lane. All of them have been associated with documentaries, fake documentaries. And Oliver Stone pretty much exclusively covers CIA stories. You know, Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, Vietnam, that's a CIA war, Operation Phoenix, CORDS program. It's a CIA corporate funded, corporate participation exercise. It wasn't a war. It's more of an experiment for weaponry and pacification and control techniques, which are all in force in the United States today. Everything that was done in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s is being done today in the United States through Operation Gladio, Operation Phoenix, Operation Chaos, Operation COVID. They did all of those things in Vietnam decades ago. And Oliver Stone wants to tell you what to think about that. You know, his first movie, remember, in Turkey, Istanbul, you know, where the boy is caught with some drugs and is going to spend life in prison. Well, that's a CIA story, right? Drug trafficking. That's CIA 101, right? JFK, CIA murder assassination. Wall Street, it's a CIA film about the meta-universe that people think is the stock market and the bond market and mergers and acquisitions and the disposal and using financial weaponization to destroy or create. For example, in a normal world, Google, Amazon, Facebook could never exist. They would never have been created because they had to go 20 years before they ever could possibly make a profit. And there are no investors that are willing to wait 20 years to make a profit. But if you're a bank and you want to create a weapon that you're going to use against the people for pacification and control, you can easily finance companies to do that, which they do. Part of the military-industrial complex. All right, so those are 3 examples of people who you should strongly distrust and question and be highly skeptical, if not cynical of. Mark Lane, okay, Laurence Schiller, who's still alive at age 86, and Oliver Stone, who's still alive at age 76, you know, the man who's friends with Timothy Leary, who goes over to give Timothy Leary a birthday card or a get well card over at the Sharon Tate murder scene at 10106 Sunbrook Drive, right down the ice plant from Abigail Folger's lifeless corpse. There's Oliver Stone, you know, paying tribute to a CIA career agent of LSD. Tune in, turn on, drop out, Timothy Leary. That's Oliver Stone. That's my third anchored bias person. I'm going to throw Robert Kennedy Jr. in there because he's on his 3rd marriage now to a Hollywood actress, Cheryl Hines, who won't allow you into their home unless you have a PCR test, which we all know there's no such thing as a PCR test. There's PCR DNA collections procedures. I don't know why she'd care about that, but you can't get into her home without a negative PCR and vax paperwork. So I don't think you can be the leader of the truth movement and be married to a Hollywood actress who's in a Hollywood cult, which obviously Robert Kennedy Jr. is in that cult, as is Oliver Stone, as is Laurence Schiller, as was Mark Levin, aka Mark Lane. All right. Then, don't get me started, I got Dominck Dunne. He injected himself in the OJ case, and of course he, at the same time, injected himself into the Jose Enrique Menendez murder, which was a professional hit, and Dominck Dunne went a long way to try to convince you that the children did it, the boys. There was no evidence that they did. There was no evidence. There was no direct evidence that they did. So his brother, John Dunne, works for Time Life magazine, and his wife, John Dunne's wife, Joan Didion, the sister-in-law to Dominck Dunne, she worked for Vogue magazine, and she purchased the 18 dresses that Linda Kasabian wore at the Charlie Manson murder trial, which I believe is a conflict of interest when you're a member of the media and pretending to be a journalist who's objective, and you're purchasing the wardrobe for a witness who witnessed nothing, whose husband works for the CIA, Robert Kasabian, who's in Rio de Janeiro at the time that Linda Kasabian was testifying at the Manson murder, and Joe Didion, formerly of Vogue magazine, she's buying the wardrobe for the key witness in the case because Susan Atkins recanted her so-called fake confession, so you couldn't use her. So you went with the witness that never was present. Linda Kasabian was not present during any murders. She drove the getaway car, remember? The getaway car? The car that would never fit on the driveway? Yeah, the Ford Galaxy. And then, of course, you have Karen Lamb, who I'd like to talk to Robert Lamb of Chicago to tell me what her problem was. She got whacked or died at age 49, but she married and divorced Robert Lamb, and then she married and divorced Dennis Wilson twice, the drummer of the Beach Boys. She married and divorced him twice. So she's married 3 times to 2 men, and she injects herself in the Jose Menendez story by claiming that she's best friends to Kitty Menendez, and that she was there when the phone call came in from Jose that said, "Yeah, honey, we got your zip code," which is a complete poppycock mendacity of a story. And Karen Lamb becomes an executive producer of a fake documentary over the Menendez case, when the whole story was that the Menendezes lived in Calabasas and were 2 years into a remodel of a 14-acre ranch home, 9,000 square foot in Calabasas, which is 18 miles away from this Beverly Hills rental home that was home to Michael Jackson and Elton John. Why would Jose Menendez want to live in that home? It's a 20-minute further commute to get up to Canoga Park to work with Noel Bloom in the porn industry, which is what Lyle Menendez's father, Jose, was in the porn business, working in Canoga Park, you know, up there by Calabasas, West Hills, Hidden Hills, aka Tarzana, aka Encino. Just give you some other nicknames for the Canoga Park, which everyone doesn't want to be associated with Canoga Park because everyone knows it's porn. Charlie Manson lived in Canoga Park at a 2-acre property for about 9 months. I don't know. He didn't have a problem living in Canoga Park. He wasn't involved with the porn industry, though. But he lived in Canoga Park. So I just can't get over the number of Jewish people coming out of New York who changed their name so that you won't think they're Jewish, and they get involved with this false messaging business. But it's quite extensive. I'm sure I've glossed over a bunch. We know they're about Dr. Albert Levin, who's a medical doctor, psychiatrist for MK Ultra, who ran Bellevue Medical Hospital, which is a New York State hospital, and also had his wife murdered by some young girl that he taught at Fordham University in his psychology class, who he gave 19 electroshock treatments to her brain. Then she went over and murdered his wife. Yes, she did. And that is a Jewish psychiatrist in New York, in close proximity to where these other knuckleheads came out of. I mean, because, you know, Laurence Schiller and Mark Levine and Oliver Silverstein, they all came out of the same area that Albert Levin operated in. It's the same area that Frank Olson, you know, did a Superman dive off the 13th floor onto the sidewalk at the Stratton Hotel, who worked for, you know, the bioweapons laboratory at Fort Detrick. Not too far away from where Dr. Fauci has an office. I think he has an office at Fort Detrick also, as well as the National Health Institute, which is across the Potomac River from Langley, Virginia, and the CIA, in close proximity. There you go. All right, that's my point, is that beware of all these fake authors who get books distributed on Amazon. If your book's being distributed on Amazon, you really should double and triple check all the facts. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.